This week in post, it's unscripted, uncut, it's a live edit. Hi everyone, I'm Scott Davenport. Welcome to In Post. So today, doing a live edit. Live in air quotes, I'm not broadcasting live, but what I mean by this is I'm going to grab a photo from my library I've never worked on before and just take it through start to finish. We'll see what happens. I hope that we'll end up with a good photo. There may be some switchbacks and backtracking along the way, some mistakes to be made, but that's all part of the learning process. And kind of continuing with the Oregon themed week, I have one from the workshop that I hosted a couple weeks ago, and this was one of the first mornings. I think it was our very first morning, and very bluish, semi-overcast day. But the rocks and the sea stacks were awesome, and so I'm doing a quick image assessment on this. And, mainly I want to make sure I bring out detail on the rock. The foreground's quite dark. The smoothness of the sand is great. Maybe clean up these types of little things and potentially crop so that this lower left corner here just isn't as distracting. And so actually let's start with that. Let's start with the crop. So I'm going to hit the R for the crop tool here in Lightroom and just kind of nudge this up from the bottom. And that's looking pretty good. While I'm here, let's check leveling. So that, whoops, I closed the tool. Come on. First mistake right out of the chute. And we'll try to level that right there. Actually, it looks like it was pretty darn level, so I did a good job in the field on that one. That's cool. And now for some distraction cleanup. So with that bit of cropping, we've got some things down here at the bottom. And so since I'm going to be doing stuff with the retouch and healing brush, I might as well do my dust spot sweep as part of this. So I'm going to zoom in, and I'm using the function keys on a Mac. These usually are page up and page down on a Windows machine. So Q key and then A to toggle on and off this visualize spots. And the reason I like to work this way is now I can go through the whole scene pane by pane. And the first thing I'll do is just get rid of this little tiny bird that's up here because it's not really adding to the photo. And I'll do a next panel of stuff. That all looks pretty good. Next panel of stuff. We know we're going to get rid of these tiny bits of foam that are kind of isolated. Whoa, Lightroom, I don't know why you're choosing that. That makes no sense to me. And that doesn't look all that good. So let's see. There's the feather down on that. Actually, let's go ahead and switch it to a clone instead. That's looking a little better. A little better. Not incredibly good. Try a different sample spot. That's better. All right. And we'll get this one here. Same type of thing. Since we're dealing with some of this texture in the sand, we'll do a clone. And that's looking pretty nice. All right. Pane to the next page area. Sky looks pretty clear. This must be the newer of my cameras because there aren't as many sensor spots. All right, this one will be a little challenging. I want to make sure I keep some of that nice flow of the sand there. So I want to make sure I take my sample to the right and then just kind of line that up a little bit. That looks good. I'm not sure how well that's going to come through on compressed internet video, but I made sure to line up those little streaks that were in the sand. And a few more here. So let's go ahead and click on that one. Now these are soft, so I'm going to switch this back to, actually it is defaulting to a heel. Good. I'm going to keep that as a heel and not as a clone, which makes me think I need to go back and check that other one that I had previously in the sand there. So that's looking good. Maybe one more right there. Cool. I don't think I need to digitally clean the beach too much more than that. Page down. That looks nice. I will go back out and I want to check this one and make sure that's a clone because that is important to me for those details there. So let's see. Looks too bright. Let's see here. You know what? Maybe I should keep it as a heel because that looked better. Well, I guess that's a soft enough area. Yep, we're going to keep it that way. All right, great. All right, so moving on to basics. Actually, even before I move on to basics, there's one other spot that I see, and this isn't a dust spot per se, but it's a sign that's up on this rock. this little guy right here. And certainly this wasn't a factor at this tide, but when the tide goes out very low, you can walk right out to these rocks, and the sign basically says don't climb up here, because besides it being very tall, you might end up cutting yourself off from land when the tide comes in, which is not good. All right, so let's get on to our basics. Let's start with white balance. I always like to try auto a little bit. It's going to warm it up quite a bit, and that's pretty okay. I'm going to nudge that a little bit cooler. Not too much. Let's see, exposure overall is pretty good. Let's start with the whites. Moving that, nudging it up. We see that, we'll back it off. Give myself a little bit of breathing room on that histogram. Blacks look like we got a solid black point. I don't need much at all. Yeah, those deep shadows on the right-hand side are just fine. I'm going to reset that to 0, open up those shadows. Now we can start to see that foreground and pull back the highlights a bit so the sky maintains some of that texture. And I'm going to play with tone a little bit. This is more of an artistic choice. I'm a sucker for that purplish hue that we get at twilight. I'm going to amp that up just a touch here. Okay, so I think I've got my basics done. Now I'm going to move into playing around with contrast a little bit. I want contrast on the rocks for sure, and maybe some in the surf, but I don't want it everywhere. And so I'll play a tiny bit with the globals here in the basic panel. But I'm going to be pretty gentle on these ones because I want them to really focus on the rocks, and this won't be the right tool for that. Like clarity, I don't want to push that very far. Instead, let's try using, which is reasonably new to me because I've only recently updated my Lightroom, is the stuff with the range masks and so forth. So I'm going to fart with that. Fart? I'm not going to fart. I'm going to start with this gradient right here. And let me turn, I'll leave that on for the moment because I want to isolate this to the rocks. And so I'm going to start with the luminance and start reducing the range. So I don't want it in the brights, I want it in the shadows. And the shadows are going to be my rocks. I'll nudge this up a little farther, avoid getting too much of that contrast in the water. And that's a pretty well isolated mask. The other thing I can do is if I want to clean up the beach a little bit, I'll use a brush. But let's stick with that. And now I'll play with things like clarity and contrast. And so that's going to make those rocks harder and sharper. And I might even open up their shadows tiny bit. I don't want too much on that. I don't want to lose that. The scene's very monochromatic, and I'm okay with that. But we're going to just keep working on this. I want to do that same thing, but with this center rock here. So for that one, let's make a quick note of my settings. My range is kind of, this thing's like underneath the A or so that's be a good starting point. But I want to use a radial on this one because this rock is just kind of off by itself and doesn't need to have too much else done to it. Got invert set already, that's great. Range for luminance. Bring that down. Whoops. Let's grab it. I was already watching the screen and I hadn't grabbed the actual slider. Maybe move that up there a little bit. Okay. Turn that off. And let's try that same type of, add a little bit of contrast. This one I want to boost clarity a little harder because this is foreground, this is mid to background. There was a fair amount of mist on this morning, and so a little bit of softness on those rocks in the background. I mean, a little bit, that's going to be okay. But let's also open shadows. Some. Okay. All right. So what else is going on here? The foreground still feels a little heavy to me in terms of its brightness. It's a little dark. So let's go back to gradient, and we'll add a new one. I'll just kind of drag it upward from here, position it roughly there, and just do a little nudge on the exposure. That's nicer. Let me see that before and after. Of course, it's going to affect my contrast on my rocks back there, but I'm really watching the foreground right now. And with that foreground, I may also take the white point up a little bit. That's going to brighten the foam. See that foam getting a little bit brighter, especially in these foregrounds here. All right, experiment time. I'm going to press the V key, V as in Victor, and look at this in black and white, and just kind of take a moment and take this in and see, do I like this as a monochromatic scene or not? And if I do, I'll keep it this way. If I don't, my next thinking is doing some split toning. I like how the surf feels brighter and there is more visual separation between the foreground rocks and the background rocks when we're looking at it in black and white. Look at it in color, it tends to get lost. You know, I'm missing stuff here. So instead, I'm still sucking for those purple tones. So instead of losing the purple, let's try this. Grab a gradient here and just cover the entire scene, right? The whole dang thing, and then just drag it down in the bottom there. And for the moment, let's just take exposure up, you know, let's something healthy. We can see this. Now, we'll do some masking. So we'll do luminance, and I want to not affect the shadowy areas. Now this is starting to give me that better separation that I was after. And now that, let's take a look at what that mask has done for us. So it should be roughly, okay, there is some, not all, on the rocks and so forth. More of it is concentrated on the brighter areas. And if I were to push this farther, we'd start to see it really disappear from those rocks. Maybe too much. Let's see. Play with that slider one more time. I can adjust the smoothness too to really focus it in on just the darker areas like that. You can see the difference in smoothness. You know, you're kind of saying, don't be so gradual with those tones, Lightroom. Zero in on things more. All right, so that looks pretty cool. Now, what about playing with that tint some more? Now the tint, since we have this mask, I'm not affecting the rocks. Going with that purple type feel for it. Here's how we're going to test this. We're going to take this one and I'm going to, first off, not hover over it. I'm going to delete it and then undo that. That'll be our way to check just that particular gradient. All right, now I'm going to compare that against black and white again. So the V key after, you know, all said and done, I think I still like this as a black and white image more. There's, like I mentioned at the beginning here, there's not a lot of color. It's pretty monochromatic. And even, you know, my toying is an experiment with trying to get some of those purples to come out. It's not working for me. So I'm going to hit the V key. I'm going to leave that on. And at this stage, just finish off with this particular gradient that I have. Since I have that mask set already, be pretty aggressive with the contrast. I like the black and whites to be more punchy. Let's go ahead also nudge that white point up and the highlights. And this is, I'm really watching the surf right now. I'm going to go revisit one of these other ones. This one here. Let me hover on that one. That's our foreground one. Okay, so let's, all right, I'll click on this one. These are too close together for me to do a single selection. Those were our rocks. I'm going to punch up contrast on those. Open the shadows a tiny bit more. And we're going to need something for the sky, because the sky is too bright now. So let's do a new gradient. Whoops. New. Okay. Pull that down here. And we're going to take our highlights back. And I don't think I'll need to do any masking on that, because the rocks are so shadowy. And even though the mask is covering all of that stuff, there's no highlights to pull back with that. So that's better. All right. Moving into black and white. This is the mix that it gave us. So when I hit that V key, it's automatically switching things to black and white, and Lightroom by default does this automatic mix. And I'm kind of okay with that, but I do want to just kind of hover around the scene. So this is all blue. I expect that almost everything is going to be a bluish tone. Yeah, even in the sky. So I can't do too much playing directly with color channels. You know, if I tried to brighten up the rocks with the blue, that's also going to brighten up the sky. Same thing with darkening it and so forth. Instead, I will look at a curve. I'll leave the shadows as they are. I want to get a little more punch in those midtones. So let's take like our lower midtones down a little bit, our upper midtones up a little bit. That's too much. Watching that sky, I don't want that sky to get too bright. So if I take that up, pull that highlight back down, that's getting too muddy in the shadows. No, let's reset that. Try one more time here. What about the highlights? Bringing those down some, and then leveling back out a bit on those midtones. Is that really helping me out here? Before and after. A little moodier, but also a little dingier. So I'm gonna not do that. That's not working. Anything else that I didn't adjust in basic? I pulled the highlights down pretty darn far. The sky is where I want just a little bit more detail. Or I could add a little more softness to the water. Something to balance the softness of the sky with a bit of the harshness of the ocean. Let me go back to our gradients. And I had this one here. This was everywhere, right? Okay. And then this one, however, that's the rocks up on top. We know that's our sky. And then this one here is all of the foreground, and we were really just raising up the entire foreground. So what I want to do then, I'm going to duplicate this particular gradient and now move it upward. So I've got a 5th point now. And the goal here, turn this mask on, is to hit just the water area, and then I want to take the clarity slider in the reverse direction, go negative with the clarity so it gets a little bit softer. But the first job is going to be to get the rocks unaffected. So we'll do that luminance range mask again, start creeping up the range, and you can see where it's disappearing from the rocks and some of the ocean. Let's get our softness down farther. And this one may have to be a little bit of manual cleanup because I want to keep, there's some shadow areas obviously in the surf. So let's nudge range up one more notch there. I'll grab the brush, erase mode, auto mask, and just kind of get in here on these rocky areas so that those aren't being affected at all by what we're about to do with clarity. And I'll be a little sloppy with the mask for now. If I end up really liking the result, I'll clean it up in a bit here. Get through here so this rock will not get soft. It's very important this foreground rock stay nice and crisp. All right, and let's actually turn off the auto mask on the erase for the rest of the work inside this rock. It'll actually make the brush a little bit faster too. Lightroom's not working as hard to figure out what's going on. And softness on the beach, I'm going to be okay with that. That's not going to be too much of a problem. Make that brush a little smaller. Go ahead and just get right through those areas there. All right, so now that we have targeted this toward the water, let's take the exposure back down. We'll see the water start to get a little bit softer. Same thing with whites. The main thing I want to do is work with clarity. Take that clarity, and that's starting to soften it up. Notice that this is before, this is after. And by virtue of that mask, we're really kind of isolating it to just the water. And this feels a little more balanced to me, where the foreground's softer, the background's softer. I do think I want to go back and revisit just the basic settings for, close that, just for overall brightness of the photo. When I do a black and white, I do like it to be a little bit brighter. I don't want to be super dark. I'll maybe back off the shadow reduction there, or shadow opening there. All right, let me do a quick before and after here. So this is where we started. This is where we finished. Certainly a stronger image. I think at this stage, I still want a little more punch in the rocks, and that's really going to be an on-one job. I cannot get dynamic contrast anywhere else, and so I'm going to bring this over into on-one and get some final punch on the rocks and really crispen up this full image here. So let's get this sent over there. We'll do a right click and I'll do an edit in and I'll send this over to Effects 2018 and I'll see you on the other side. All right, landed over in Photo Raw 2018, the effects module. Let's get into it right away with dynamic contrast. So I'm going to add dynamic contrast to my filter stack, and those rocks are looking awesome. Now, the rest of the scene, we don't want this, right? So similar to what we were doing in Lightroom, although I have to say I prefer the masking tools here, so this is going to feel a little more natural. We get the luminosity mask right away, and I'm going to press the O key. So right now we're looking at the mask. I know this is a little strange to see because we're looking at a black and white photo. Just to show you, here's the red overlay. Now, red overlays are a little hard to work with, in my opinion, with the luminosity masks. So I'm going to switch that back to grayscale. But O key turned off. Notice the punch in the sky. O key turned on. Here's our mask. The mask itself is a little bit soft because that's telling us where the contrast is being applied, not necessarily showing us all of the contrast. Now I want the contrast applied to the rocks. Well, we're looking at the mask, so the black, darker parts mean we're not applying it, and the lighter parts mean we are. We want the exact opposite, so I'm going to invert that. Now again, we're still looking at the mask. That probably jolted your eyes just like it did mine. I'll press that O key again. Notice the contrast now, before and after. It is really focusing in on just the rocks. And I want to remove it from the beach too. And notice like the edge of the surf is it's actually even getting a halo, which is pretty interesting. It's the first time I recall seeing a halo on the edge of surf. So let's fine tune this mask. I'm going to press the O key again. And what we want to get the whitish areas over the rocks and everything else to be kind of black. And so this is really a mid-tone, right? This is like a middle gray. So let's start with playing with levels and just see what we can do here. So I'm going to shift this transition point around, darker that way. Let's start bringing up the window. And this is shrinking what tones we want to include. I want to bias things toward all these really bright white things. Now, once I reach that halfway point, we're going to start to see that beach disappear, right? Because that's our upper midtones. It's getting a little bit too far because I'm losing too much in this background rock. So I'm going to back that off. And something like that's pretty good. Turn the O key off. And now I'm going to reach for the perfect brush. I've got edge detection. Turn that on. And I'm going to click and drag through here, and I just want to check this now. O key. It did a good job right along that surf line, right? So I'm just going to keep my mask view on, kind of just nudge around here. Good, like that. Okay, and then nestle in on the rock. That's cool. Now I'm going to turn the perfect brush off. That's Command or Control R keyboard shortcut, and I can get rid of that surf line. Because I don't want to see that that odd-looking halo that was happening there around the surf's edge, right? Just sweep that all away. O key back on. Now, or off rather, let's take a look at that contrast punch, before and after. That is just on the rocks, and we can now boost it up, right? We can add a little bit more smalls, mids, and larges before and after. And that's really nice. That is kind of a nice finishing touch for this photo. I'm now looking here and wondering, can I get any other what do I call it? Separation between this particular like wizard hat type shaped thing. This is not the wizard hat, it's like another wizard hat, and this background rock. Honestly, that's going to be really tough. It would be nice to do, and I'm just not sure about how best to do it cleanly. So that, I could start to, dodge and burn and, start to pretend that there's some mist out here. But honestly, I think that's going to end up looking relatively false. And it eventually isn't going to add too much to the scene. But instead, I'm going to try a burn. And I'm going to grab, let's just set the exposure to, something kind of heavy right now. Nearly half a stop. We've got our brush set. I'm going to turn on the perfect brush. I'm going to do this at 100% opacity. so that we can really see what's going on. But the edge detection here is only going to get us so far. And it may be even difficult for you guys to see this on the video because of video compression and so forth, just where the edge of this rock is compared to the one in the background. This would be very difficult to pick out if you weren't familiar with the location, because it's just hard to see. I mean, I can start to see it now, and let's just sanity check this, see if this is even worthwhile. Not a whole lot. Let's see. Instead of the exposure, this is more experimentation now. If I were to raise exposure on that a little bit, or add in some structure on that particular rock to make it pop out, it's up the shadows. It's so subtle. I don't think it's worth the effort. If this were one of those killer photos that everything else was great in it, I would spend the time and do the extra work on it to make it even better. But I'm just not feeling that with this photo. So I'm going to get rid of that local adjustment. And now I'm going to undo it and see if it actually, now look at it in the distance, it makes a difference. So I stand corrected. I'm going to leave that there. That's mainly the shadows opening up. So I'm going to leave it as it is. One more time, before and after. Yeah, zoomed out, that looks okay. And I can imagine if I did end up printing this and putting it on a wall or something, that little detail would make a difference. Vignette, I don't think I'm going to do it on this one. This one was pretty okay. So at this stage, I'm going to call it done. Hit that. That'll go back to Lightroom, and this photo's going to be considered finished. The tip of the week, I think it's this dodge and burn thing, where you need to look at it both zoomed in when you're usually zoomed in doing your detailed dodging and burning, and then take a look at it zoom back out. It may feel wrong when you're zoomed in, but looking at it from a distance, it might work for the scene overall. And vice versa. If you're zoomed in and things look great, zooming out, you might go, that's now either too bright or it's not balanced with some other part of the scene. And that'll wrap up this week's In Post. A little bit of a long one, but I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, let me know somehow. Comments on the video are always appreciated. Social shares are too. Likes, +1s, whatever platform you're on, I'd appreciate it if you let me know in some way, shape, or form you got some value out of this. And if you got questions about photography, hit me up. You can contact me through my website. You can leave comments. And I usually turn a response around in a day or so. And I might end up using your question as fuel for a future video. So I always appreciate your thoughts or your questions. And until next time, my name's Scott Davenport. Happy shooting.